Welcome to Landmark Talks Property, a podcast by Landmark Information Group that covers all things property in short and intelligent podcasts.
Hello everyone, welcome to this Landmark podcast. Today we'll be looking at the Landmark Property Trends Report for Q3 of 2025. For those people who are new to the podcast or new to the Trends Report, the Landmark Property Trends Report looks at data points that we have within Landmark across the residential transaction process, from estate agency through to completion through conveyancing, and looking at mortgage valuations and searches in the middle of the process. And we'll be looking at that for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and for Scotland separately with our separate business, Landmark Scotland. Before we get into the detail, I'd like to introduce you to our guests today, who are the business unit experts within Landmark. And reading around the screen as I can see it, we're joined by Richard Hepburn, who is Managing Director of Landmark Scotland, Ben Robinson, who is Managing Director of Landmark Estate Agency Services, Liz Jarvis, who is Managing Director of Search and Legal at Landmark, and Rob Gurney, who is Managing Director of Ochresoft Conveyancing Case Management. So before we dig into the detail, from a high-level point of view, to just summarise where we are within Q3, I think the term was coined internally as suspended animation. It feels like we're in a market which is not great but not terrible, and is plodding along with all eyes looking towards the budget next month. Activity is okay, but not as busy as it could be, and we think that there is some nervousness within purchasers looking at what might be coming over the horizon within the budget, and the stats certainly point to that, as our guests will jump into when we go into the detail. So if we first look at the first slide that we have, or first page within our report, which is cross-market activity trends. So we look there at the data points for listings, sold subject to contracts, searches ordered, and completed property transactions. And we benchmark these to 100% being the equivalent month last year. And then we adjust for trading days to give us a view year on year as to where we are at each step in the transaction. Liz, if you don't mind, I'll come to you first to give us a view of what we're seeing in that cross-market activity, please.
Well, normally, Mike, around this time, we would have started to see the market really ramp up in autumn, and that's because the time period that people would typically be ordering searches would be to see them enter into their new homes in time for Christmas and over the winter months. But that just didn't happen this year. So what we saw was began to sort of slow down in October. So in August. So we normally see when the schools go back in England and Wales, we see a bit more activity just before that. But that slowdown then continued over the summer months and didn't reinvigorate. So we had some kind of peaks throughout the month, but nothing consistent, unfortunately. And it would just seem to be, as you said, the phrase suspended animation, that all of the intel that we have and people we're speaking to would seem to say that people are waiting for the November budget, essentially, at the end of November.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And the numbers in that cross-market activity view certainly suggest that. To run through those percentages, listing volumes down just 1% on last year, sold subject to contract down 6% on last September, searches ordered in line with last year, and completed volumes up a modest 1%. I think it's fair to say that 2024 was still at subdued levels compared to the long-term normal as well. So, as I said at the top of the conversation, not a terrible market, but also not an overly inspiring one either. When we jump into the further detail into the report, the next one in our report is the market supply growth, which is around listings. So we talked about that listing volume being down compared to the equivalent equivalent quarter last year. Ben, would you like to give us a bit more colour on that from the estate agents side?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it was down on last year, although last year was a relatively healthy year for supply. I think what underlies that, though, if you break the months down, is that story of unease news associated to the budget, in that actually the quarter started up and then dropped off quite significantly over the second 2 months, which suggests people are putting off the decision to come to the market, and that ultimately is the start of the pipeline. So it's going to impact downstream numbers as we go to the end of the year, no doubt.
Great, thank you. And then the other chart that takes supply into the equation is what we call demand-supply variance. First of all, would you like to kind of talk through what that is and why we see it as a key indicator in the market, and then also what we can see from the data in quarter three around there?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, obviously, demand and supply linked into one and showing the pattern together, essentially trying to establish whether they're in lockstep, whether year on year, or whether, they're down year, or actually out of kilter, which has happened. I mean, if we think post-COVID, demand went through the roof and we couldn't get enough properties to the market. And actually then it's flipped since the sort of mini budget a while back now, but it flipped into a buyer's market where actually there's lots of supply, but not necessarily commitment downstream. So we've seen both extremes actually in the last few years. And this is a really good indicator. And actually, if we look through the quarter, initially it looked for the first time in the year that they were in lockstep. But I think what we've seen towards the end is both of them, yes, out kilter a little bit, but following the same pattern of being subdued. And to be honest, when we look anecdotally, talking to agents on the ground, it's been a really odd year in that there have got lots of stock and not the commitment. The commitment started coming through and now it's tailed off again. And actually what we've seen in some areas is price reductions, because obviously that causes price reductions. There'll be people who've motivated to move will move the price to try and get there in a time of low demand. We've actually seen price reductions often outstrip sales, which is just unheard of. But again, that's a market trying to find balance. Normally a market does. I think our challenge now, looking at the numbers, is that people put decisions off. It's not necessarily don't want to move. We just don't want to move right now. We want to wait and see. And if they want to wait and see till the budget, that's the end of November, which takes you into Christmas. And ultimately, you can't see it picking up post there until the new year. So anyone very keen to move is really having to cut the price significantly to make sure that it's a deal that's attractive enough to almost force commitment through. So those sales are getting harder to come by. And of course, the ones at the right price have sold. And if new stock isn't coming in, it's going to be quite a year for agents on the ground.
Thanks, Ben. So that, at risk of putting words in your mouth, it feels like we're unlikely to see any change to current activity levels before the new year. Yeah,
exactly that. We normally sort of get a peak at this time. As Liz mentioned, we've not really seen that for the reasons we've sort of agreed upon. That's making for quite a bit of turmoil for agents on the ground. And unfortunately, I don't see that going away until the new year. And we've got clarity on the budget and what that means. Let's hope that it's clarity that doesn't cause further uncertainty.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with that one. And moving on to the next part of the report, we look at the conveyancing market activity. And Rob, you are our conveyancing expert. If you'd like to talk us through how things are in conveyancing world in the last quarter.
Sure. There's not a great deal to talk about other than what we've already said, Mike, in terms of the subdued nature of the quarter. It's absolutely been felt in the conveyancing sector as well. Obviously, we monitor new case instructions as well as completions in the previous 3 months, and compare those to last year. And basically what we're seeing for the months of July and September, there was a very, very similar number achieved versus the new instruction levels in those months of the previous year. We're at 98% for July and September, so nearly at last year's levels for those 2 months. But August was a different beast. August dropped down to 87% of the 2024 number, which, it's usual to see a drop off in the summer holidays in terms of new case instructions for lawyers. But actually, it's fair to say that this year was definitely more pronounced than normal. I'm not sure if there's sort of anything to read into that, but that's the numbers that, statistically that we ended up with. So, yeah, 2 reasonable months compared to last year, and then 1 disappointing one, slap bang in the middle.
That's interesting, and I guess it's a bit early to see whether there's any kind of trend that we can read into August, but it's certainly one that we'll keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, it just comes back to that whole, nervousness and the lack of commitment and subdued nature that we keep talking about. When you look at the completion side of the equation, it was actually slightly different in terms of the outcome this year versus last for those 3 months is actually quite favourable, particularly September. Percentage-wise, we end up with, I think, about 122% of completions versus September 24. But when you look back at the actual numbers from the previous year, there was an unusually slow September in 24, which obviously means that it's not necessarily a huge swing in completion numbers that's causing that, but just a comparison to the month of the previous year. But yeah, completion numbers are holding up versus last year, and then obviously massively exceeded for the month of September, which again is an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And one of the things we look at is the completion to instruction ratio, yes, which I know is a key indicator for to assess conveyancing capacity. Can you give us a bit more background about why it's so important, and also what we've seen in that area over the last quarter?
Yeah, I mean, we always say completion to instruction ratio is a really good indicator of the potential capacity for lawyers in the market. A nice healthy high percentage shows a nice moving pipeline, and obviously if the percentage is lower, then it suggests a build-up of work, which can cause problems if not if left unchecked. What we saw in the previous quarter, Mike, was an actual quite a large and significant increase in that percentage, which I think shows 2 things. Firstly, the last quarter is the first sort of normalization after the SDLT disruption that we had in early on in the year, because clearly the craziness of the spring SDLT changes impacted the summer as well, in terms of lack of completions after the event. So I think it's fair to say that the previous quarter was more reflective of a more sort of normalization market. And also, I think, we've already said it again, I'll say it again, the subdued nature of where we currently are in terms of instruction numbers, I think is probably the primary reason why the percentage is higher. So we're not necessarily saying there's loads of completions happening. We're just saying that in comparison to the number of instructions happening, completions are higher. So it's kind of conveyancers are in a good place in terms of managing their caseloads and managing their portfolios, but we're certainly not suggesting that there's a plethora of work, because there isn't.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting to look back on March as well in terms of the impact of stamp duty, which we will have talked about in our podcast, running through that report. But when you look at the chart, it really does stick out like a sore thumb. The over 100% completion to instruction ratio, and then the follow-on impact in April from 105 down to 30% in two months is a stark difference. Just shows Absolutely. The impact that had on the market.
Yeah, and like I say, the previous quarter has been bouncing around the 60-70% mark, which is kind of upper normal levels.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Rob. The next section on the trends report looks at mortgage valuation activity, and so that comes from our Landmark Valuation Services business, and we look at the number of mortgage valuations we're supporting in the market, compared to the equivalent month of the prior year, and also against the Bank of England mortgage approvals what it shows us this last quarter is a more of the same. So to echo the point that our other guests have talked about, which is that a pretty flat position on mortgage valuation activity. When we look at the kind of the gap between peaks and troughs of weekly averages, we're in single digit percentages, and whereas normally what we see is more fluctuation when we look at rates changing, product availability and things like that. We'll see a bit of a rush of activity as things change within the market, and we've not really seen that, and I think that's reflective of pretty stable mortgage pricing and kind of fairly stable levels of demand as well. But what we have seen is that slow up a little bit running into September for the points I think that our other guests have made, which is around wariness running into a budget. I think the other interesting thing to point out is the variation between purchase and remortgage volumes. So in the Bank of England mortgage approvals for for July and August, mortgage valuation for mortgage approvals were up 43% year on year. So there's an awful lot of strong activity in the remortgage market, which would also suggest that slightly quieter in sale or purchase, which again reflects on the points that everyone else was making. So that brings us to the end of the review of the England and Wales property trend report. And sat very patiently in the background, we've had Richard Hepburn, who's the Managing Director of Landmark Scotland. And Richard, it's a one-man mission from now on for you to talk us through activity in Scotland, and what we track within the Scottish market, and also what it's telling us.
Okay, I mean, I think in terms of the overall market, the story this time around mirrors what's happening south of the border. So there are definitely some signs that the market's softening in terms of listing volumes through this quarter. Although it's a bit early to tell whether that's driven by the same uncertainties as in England about property taxation, as that actually comes under control of the Scottish Government. So I think the very late Westminster budget this year and noises around those changes to property taxation may well have spilled over into some nervousness up here too, with that delay also meaning that the Scottish budget isn't now until mid-January, so 7 weeks after Rachel Reeves speaks. So we may not see much happening till January either as a result. How radical that budget will be, I don't know, because we've got Scottish Government elections in May 2026. So that we may not see very much happening to rock the boat. I think overall buyer behaviour seems to be positive in the quarter, so higher listing levels early in the year flowed through to strong demand. Although, as in England, we saw a lot of volatility over July, August and September down to the holiday season. And we have actually seen our kind of sold subject to missives, sold subject to contract level here, slightly lagging completions across the quarter. So that maybe does indicate a little bit of a slowdown. And we certainly, as in England, haven't seen any very noticeable post-summer, early autumn bounce. So that's the kind of top level picture, Mike.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. Are there any more takeaways you'd like to leave people with for Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously we track our listings through estate agency onboarding and AML data. So we actually saw that down 4% compared with 2024 in the quarter. Although we did have really high stock went into the quarter, so yeah, on the basis of strong performance in the two earlier quarters, I think that's why we've ended up with stronger buyer activity. But we did dip down 9% in listings in September, so that's definitely something to monitor in terms of news.
And do you think there's anything that might be leading? Challenging question to give you. Anything might be leading to that dip in listings?
I don't think so. I mean, it could be the same effects as in England. It could just be a kind of post-summer effect. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of, as we said, there's a lot of stagnant activity around generally, and that's probably flowed through to us as well.
General economic uncertainty.
I think so.
That makes absolute sense. Thank you very much, Richard. And that brings us to a close of the Q3 Property Trends Report webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you very much to our panellists for all of your insight. And please go to landmark.co.uk to have a look at the latest report. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Landmark Talks Property. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please hit subscribe. This podcast is for general purposes only. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not constitute professional advice.